Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Astor Institute. I'm really glad to see so many of you here and that you made it through the heat wave, through the long travels for those from Ukraine. My name is Gabriela Chlevskaite, and I'm a senior researcher here at the Astor Institute, and I will be your moderator today, so you will not hear so much from me. Tonight, our guests will shine light on a topic that is still underreported, stigmatized, overlooked in legal and policy discourse: conflict-related sexual violence against men. And knowing that we have quite a few presentations and discussion points, I will keep it very brief and we'll just let you know what is in store. So first, we will hear from our long-term supporters, the Embassy of Ukraine, the Embassy of Lithuania, as well as the International Bar Association. We will continue with an intervention from survivor, Roman. Thank you again for being here. Then, following Roman's intervention, International Partnership for Human Rights and Truth Hounds will present their report, which is also being released today. So there will be a QR code at the end of the event where you can find the report and read it. And we will then have a panel discussion on accountability pathways. So looking at what can we do with the information that you will have learned by the end of this event. There will be a Q&A after the panel discussion, so please keep your questions for then. And I would also like to ask you not to take any pictures or videos of this event. We will have colleagues who will be around taking some pictures from the angles that are acceptable, and it is also being recorded, so parts of the event will be released later, and you can relive it if you want. So to open this evening, I would like to invite His Excellency Andrei Kostin for opening remarks. You have the floor. I'll just switch this up.
Thank you, Gabriela. Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, survivors, and friends of justice. I want to begin with the fact that is crucially important for our today's discussion. Sexual violence against men in conflict is one of the most underreported, underacknowledged, and under-prosecuted categories of atrocity crimes in the world. Not because it is rare, because silence has been allowed to stand in for truth. As of June, Ukrainian authorities have registered 400 facts of conflict-related sexual violence, with 150 men as victims. But this is only regarding civilians. At the same time, while conducting interviews with our prisoners of war that were released from Russian captivity, we hear multiple devastating facts of torture, inhuman treatment, and unfortunately sexual violence. This is not incidental violence. This is a method of warfare. Russia wields sexual violence as a weapon, deliberately, systematically, and within institutional chain of command. Male survivors of sexual violence face a particular burden: the fear of not being believed, the expectation that strength and victimhood are mutually exclusive. The stigma is there. I hope that tonight's discussion helps that the situation changes. Truth beneath silence documents what Russia has done. The authors of this report have documented their findings, verified and attributed them. They have given this crime a face, a geography, and a command structure. We commend Truth Hounds and the International Partnership for Human Rights for their extraordinary work. I sincerely thank the International Bar Association and the Human Rights Institute of the IBA, the Astor Institute, and our co-hosts from the Embassy of Lithuania for standing with us tonight. The system is traditionally designed with female survivors as the default, while the men are often left in the shadow with their own traumas, misperceptions, even guilt. In my previous position as a Prosecutor General of Ukraine, I considered these investigations as one of the main priorities, as the most challenging and sensitive ones. While dealing with such type of cases, we had to ensure not only the thorough investigation and collection of evidences, but also the protection of the interests of survivors, not allowing their re-traumatization. For this purpose, the special unit was established in the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine to provide the adequate response to all challenges that we faced during the investigations and prosecutions. We built very strong partnership with the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten, and her team to embrace the best practices and experience in this field to ensure victim-centered approach. All this is integrated in what we call a web of accountability, 5 interlocking pillars that together constitute our response to the crimes Russia is committing on our territory. Now, our Victim Support Unit of the Office of Prosecutor General today is assisting 176 individuals who have survived conflict-related sexual violence, people who often after years of silence found the courage to engage with justice. That trust is not given. It is built carefully through confidentiality, peer solidarity, and long-term institutional support. Beyond our borders, universal jurisdiction proceedings across Europe are expanding the geography of accountability. The Joint Investigation Team, Ukraine and 6 EU states, the International Criminal Court and Europol, coordinated through Eurojust, is building cases, sharing evidence, and ensuring there is no safe haven for perpetrators anywhere in the world. Our cooperation with the International Criminal Court and establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression are key to provide the accountability on the international level. And of course, accountability without reparation is incomplete. The Register of Damage and Claims Commission are there to ensure remedies for victims and survivors of these heinous crimes. I want to conclude with something about stigma. I hope that such reports and events like we are today will help to overcome this barrier and let the truth to come out. Indeed, what is done cannot be reverted, but those responsible should be brought to responsibility for all the crimes committed. As it is a result of state-driven policy, it should be not only the direct perpetrators, but also the higher officials who developed the strategy and gave the criminal orders. Only with justice delivered, we can ensure healing and reconciliation for those who suffered. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. I would now like to ask His Excellency Laimonas Tallat-Kelpsha to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Your Excellency, former Vice Minister of Justice and Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, the colleagues, survivors, and all the distinguished participants of this important event tonight. What to start with? I start with this morning news. What happened this morning? This morning, Russia struck. So that this morning, the news came again that Russia struck Kiev in southern Ukraine. At least 3 civilians were killed, almost 10, as we now for the moment, were severely wounded. In the Donetsk region, 3 more civilians were killed in an aerial bomb attack, and 3 more died in the Sumy region, 1 in Kharkiv region. And we also learned that Russia attacked Zaporizhia Oblast, destroying Miklashevsky estate, and unique 19th century architectural and historical monument. Local experts and historians now warn this will never be re-established. The sad part and the tragic part of this reporting is it has become like a natural, organic part of the morning routine. that most of us, and especially diplomats, face each day. We have grown accustomed to this kind of reporting. And yet, each of these reports is more than just a number, it's more than just another headline. Each of them reports to possible war crimes by Russia, crimes that must be investigated, crimes that must be documented, and crimes that must be answered with justice. Well, happily, over the past few months, another line of reporting has also emerged to become part of our daily morning's news read. For example, Ukrainian forces have again struck an oil terminal or transport infrastructure inside Russia, limiting Moscow's logistics capacity and reducing the income that fuels its war machine. Ukraine's European allies have just recently agreed on a new round of sanctions against Russia, further constraining Russia's ability to continue its aggression. And this is good news. It is our duty to keep such news coming. But yet, beyond this dominant, large picture, there are episodes that remain heavily underreported, and also grave crimes that still go largely unattended. Two recent accounts have stayed with me and have deeply unsettled me recently. The first one was reported by the Times on 16th of June. It told a story of Sofia, a Ukrainian girl from a village in the Kharkiv region, where she lived with her disabled mother and two younger brothers. So when Russian forces occupied the village, one soldier forced her into an impossible choice, threatening to take away the lives of her family. What followed was not a single act of violence, but a prolonged ordeal of rape, of captivity, and of psychological terror. The one which lasted almost 1 year. And after, when Kiev region was liberated, she was taken away on the other side of the border to Russia, where all that horror continued. And it only stopped when this guy, this Russian soldier who did that, was reported desertion by, and the Russian military police started looking after him. And we learned the story only in June 2026, like 4 years after all of that happened. The second account comes from an official document, which is the United Nations Secretary General's report on conflict-related sexual violence, which was published on 21st of April this year. It describes sexual violence by Russian government forces against Ukrainians as systematic, including against male detainees. The UN investigators verified 310 cases in this report involving rape, gang rape, genital mutilation, and applying electrical shocks to genitals. By the way, if you put this information into any artificial intelligence instrument, it just advises you to remove this as a too shocking thing to be included in any official talking. In 2/3 of these cases, survivors were subjected to multiple forms of sexual violence, and in more than half of these cases, the attacks were repeated. The UN found that such torture was used in almost all detention centers that they were examining, and still, none of the perpetrators has been brought to justice as of today. So tonight, another landmark report will be presented to us. It documents 212 male victims who were subjected to sexual violence by Russian forces while detained in the occupied parts of Ukraine. Russia's war of aggression has opened wounds so deep that they will take decades to heal. As more evidence comes to light, our understanding of this cruelty will continue to grow. and some truths will be very difficult to hear. For survivors, they may be even harder to speak, but they still must be heard, because time may help wounds to heal, but silence never does. And this is why my government, the government of Lithuania, has chosen to co-sponsor this event on Russia's weaponization of sexual violence against men in Ukraine. We want this issue to be seen, named, and understood. We know from our own history that impunity does not end suffering. It only invites new crimes. And if we are serious about a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, then these heartbreaking stories cannot be pushed aside. The survivors must be met with dignity, with compassion and practical support, and their pain must be acknowledged, their voices protected, and their recovery must be made possible. I want to thank all our partners of tonight, the Truth Hounds, International Partnership for Human Rights, the Asser Institute, the Embassy of Ukraine, and others for standing behind this important effort. And above all, I want to pay tribute to the survivor who has traveled a long way from Ukraine to share his story with us tonight. Coming forward takes immense courage, and listening to him is not only an act of respect, it is a call to accountability. We owe survivors more than sympathy. We owe them justice, support, and the assurance that their suffering will not be hidden, denied, or forgotten. Having already done so much to support Ukraine, let us deliver on this account too. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you very much. And I will leave my remarks for later. Kate Orlovsky, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the International Bar Association's Hague office and together with my colleagues from our Human Rights Institute, I am really pleased to be here today and to support this event along with our other co-sponsors. And I would join the ambassadors in thanking and congratulating Truth Hounds and IPHR on this report, which is such an important contribution to our understanding of how conflict-related sexual violence is perpetrated in Ukraine. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the survivors whose experiences are shared in the report and will be shared today for their courage and strength. Accountability for crimes committed in Ukraine is a priority for the IBA, and we are strongly supporting the range of mechanisms that can provide this accountability, all of which make critical contributions. And these include, as was mentioned, the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression, the ICC, the domestic legal system, and universal jurisdiction. Indeed, the situation in Ukraine is notable, that accountability is actively being pursued on these numerous levels and by numerous actors while the conflict is ongoing. And this means that the investigators, lawyers, and judges and civil society actors are working to bring about this accountability under very challenging circumstances, and that victims and survivors of the ongoing conflict are making the courageous choice to participate in documentation and legal proceedings with all the risks that that entails. So the IBA is supporting these actors, including through advocacy for greater support for the formal mechanisms, technical support for prosecutors and defense counsel, together with the Ukrainian Bar Association, trial monitoring for regional war crimes trials, and through our Eyewitness to Atrocities app, which has been used in Ukraine since 2017, digital documentation that will meet a standard that is admissible in domestic and international trials. So the event today is an opportunity to hear from those directly affected, and it must also serve as a reminder that it is up to states, international organizations, and civil society to ensure that the burden for accountability isn't carried by survivors, but it falls on states, courts, and institutions who are mandated to provide it. It is a reminder that calls for accountability must be met with political will, with cooperation, and with resources. And in particular, states can join the enlarged partial agreements to the Special Tribunal and Claims Commission, ensure that ICC and other arrest warrants can be and are executed in their jurisdictions, and ensure that their domestic legislation allows for cases to be tried under universal jurisdiction according to established best practices. Critically, it means ensuring that domestic and international legal frameworks are fully reflective of established standards for sexual and gender-based violence, including well-resourced and trauma-informed support for victims and witnesses during investigations and trials and in the longer term. And it also remains critical to continue to support, fund, and protect civil society, and to ensure that civil society has a seat at the table during state-led discussions about accountability. As the event today already shows, it is only with this collective approach that we have the possibility to address the serious nature and scale of crimes committed in Ukraine. And with this report, we also see the critical role of survivors and civil society organizations in continuing to push international criminal law to accurately reflect the realities of conflict-related sexual violence and to create precedents and greater understanding for situations outside Ukraine as well, where victims are equally calling for justice for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. So our discussions in The Hague have the potential to have a much wider impact and to advance accountability on multiple fronts. I thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you all for reinforcing the importance of this topic and for providing some context of what we see in the news every day. But behind every legal framework, web of accountability, every diplomatic effort we have just heard about, there are individuals whose lives this work is ultimately about. And I think especially in The Hague, we really do not hear enough from them. We have legal discussions, policy discussions, we're among diplomats and professionals, and we often feel quite far removed from the actual importance of the work. So I would like to invite Roman, who generously agreed to share his experience and to take the long journey here to The Hague. And while he sets up, just a couple of notes. If you do not speak Ukrainian, this is your moment to get your interpretation devices ready. And please, again, refrain from taking any photos. Roman, you have the floor.
Доброго дня всім.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Roman. I was born and raised in the city of Kherson. Before the start of the full-scale invasion, I ran a furniture business. I was also director of a charitable foundation supporting the Kherson Special Purpose Battalion, which we founded and which had been defending our state since 2014. I was detained on the 6th of July, 2022, and held captive for 54 days. From the very first days, from the moment I was brought into the cell on day 1, I saw the other men. They were all in a very poor physical and psychological state. One of them was wearing shorts, and I could see he had knife cuts running right through his flesh. He told me straight away that he had been tortured with electric current, with clamps attached to his genitals. Conditions in the cell were appalling. We had no access to water, we could not trim our nails, and we had no access to basic human necessities. I was then taken for my first interrogation. There were conversations and threats against my wife and family. They told me immediately that they would take me to the Donbass, that in the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, I would be shot, or if not shot, that they would transfer me to Crimea, where I would be given a life sentence. Because from 2014 I had been a member of Pravi sector for a month and a half, and of another organization called UNA UNSO, the Ukrainian National Self-Defense, the Ukrainian National Assembly, NGO, not a paramilitary organization. I was then taken for a second interrogation, where they tortured me with electric current. They attached one wire here, another there, and straight away, as the conversation began, they started beating me with electric shocks. I was sitting in a chair, with a bag over my head so I could see nothing, and they started with the electric shocks straight away, demanding that I confess to being a Nazi and a fascist. This was because, at the start of the full-scale invasion, the acting mayor of Kherson, Ihor Kolikayev, who has now been held captive for more than 4 years, since June 18th marked 4 years since his detention, had put a school under my administration, where I set up a humanitarian hub. There, we prepared food for residents and distributed around 400 portions a day. Then, during the second interrogation, while torturing me with electric current, they claimed that I was transporting explosives into Kherson through the Red Cross. This was untrue. After that, I was released from that interrogation session. There was a particular shift that ran from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. These were the worst instances of torture. During that time, I heard them take a young man out and rape him anally. They shoved a police baton into his anus. There were terrible screams throughout. It felt as though you yourself were somehow present in it. This took place right beneath our cell. Through the window, we could see everything, but no one in the cell looked, because it was simply unbearable. Afterwards, it took me some 3 to 4 days to come back to myself and begin to understand where I was. There was also cell number 17, which the guards called the Petushnya, the cell for so-called Petuki. It held men identified by the guards as members of the LGBTQ+ community. They took out the young man they had raped with the baton and forced one of the men from cell number 17 to rape him again, right there in the corridor, in front of everyone so that everyone would hear. Again, words cannot convey what that was like. There was another incident. One night after curfew, they brought in a young man, and the guards said, "You've disturbed our sleep. Now we're going to fuck you." I apologize for the language. As we understood it, they undressed him, positioned him, and tried to force a baton into him, as they did to everyone. He began screaming, "What are you doing? I have a wife, a child." They would pull back, we could tell because we could hear them talking, and then he would start shouting again, "What are you doing? I have a wife, a child. I am an ordinary heterosexual man." This happened some 3 or 4 times, and after that they let him go. They asked him whether he would break curfew again. He said he would not. The torture was not only physical, but also psychological. We could all hear when other men were being tortured, and we learned to distinguish, by the way a person screamed, how they were being beaten, and with what: electric current, a baton, or fists, because the doors of the torture rooms were left open. In our cell doors there were small square hatches, and the hatches to the outside were kept permanently open because it was so hot it was impossible to breathe otherwise. A cell built for 4 people held 8 to 10. There was no possibility of shutting anything out. We all heard who was being tortured. They demanded that detainees sing the Russian anthem and shout, "Glory to Russia, glory to Putin, glory to Shoigu." For this reason, we consider it not only physical torture, but psychological torture as well. They had specialists, professional psychologists, engaged in what they called re-education. They seemed to regard all of us either as enemies or somehow as lost souls in need of correction. After 54 days, I was released, and I began speaking with other men and trying to help those who remained in captivity, passing on medicine, warm clothing, as the weather was turning colder. Other released men began reaching out to me as well. As I made more contacts, a community of civilian captives formed organically around me. It now numbers 300 people. This began in earnest around 2024, which marks the active phase of our organization's work. When the mechanism of international interim urgent reparations became available, we learned that what happened to us falls under the category of conflict-related sexual violence and crimes against humanity, that it was systematic in nature, and that it bears all the hallmarks of genocide. We have begun working with organizations and have felt strong support from them. Our organization's core mission now is to help those who remain in captivity, because those of us who are here are, more or less, alive. Although even 3 to 4 years on, our psychological and physical condition still requires treatment. We wish to appeal to the international community to help restore justice, and we are seeking Western politicians willing to take on a form of mentorship of individual Ukrainian captives to help secure their release. This is an established practice. We also believe this must all be documented in order to increase pressure, secure further sanctions, and generate greater public attention. Maximum publicity is essential, so that the people who remain in captivity, who continue to suffer CRMSV, torture, and psychological torture, are not forgotten. Publicity alone cannot help them, but it is something we can do. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for sharing your experience. And also for, I think, stressing that we are here to listen, but we should be doing more than listening. It's amazing to hear the work that you are doing on behalf of those still in detention and trying to support what you can do. None of us are magicians. We cannot stop everything, but everyone in this room can do something, and we all have different reach. So at least with this, we're trying to bring awareness and maybe encourage others to take additional steps as well. Your testimony is also part of a larger and more shocking campaign and a deeply troubling picture of which we will now learn more about. We will now turn to the presentation of Truth Beneath Silence, Russia's Weaponization of Sexual Violence Against Men in Ukraine, a report published by International Partnership for Human Rights and Truth Hounds, which demonstrates precisely this, that what we're hearing about is not isolated incidents, not one detention center, not 5, but a widespread and systematic campaign. So I would like to invite Mariam Bajanishvili, Senior Legal Officer of IPHR, and Andriy Latsiba, Legal Counsel at Truth Hounds, to present the goals, the methodology, and the main findings of the report. You have the floor.
Thank you, Gabriel. And also to Roman for a very important intervention. As it has been already mentioned several times, we are here today. The main purpose is to present the report Truth Beneath Silence, Russia's Weaponization of Sexual Violence Against Men in Ukraine. I will proceed with my presentation in 2 parts. First of all, describing the scope and methodology of the report. And secondly, I will try to demonstrate why sexual violence on occupied Ukrainian territories is not just isolated misconduct by foot soldiers, but it's established Russian state practice. As you already heard many times, the report was prepared by International Partnership for Human Rights and Truth Hounds. It represents the first comprehensive account of conflict-related sexual violence specifically against men, which is committed in the context of Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The report authors documented stories of 212 male victims. Out of these 212 victims, and I will change the slide, out of these 212 victims, 125 cases are based on the direct statements from survivors, which the IPHR and Truth Hounds teams collected during their field missions. Our joint field missions were taking place for approximately 2 years, from 2023 to 2025. and this evidence is the main source of our report. The rest of the cases are also based on mostly on these statements, but it's based on the hearsay evidence. And finally, in terms of methodology, all the survivor testimonies are supplemented also by open sources where available, and especially when it comes to the perpetrator structures. As you can see on the slide, out of all cases, 124 was committed in Kherson, 51 in Kharkiv, and 23 in Zaporozhye Oblast. So these three regions are the main focus of the report. However, we also have some isolated cases from the rest of the occupied Ukrainian territories, and we also want to make a disclaimer that by no means we think that this exhausts the actual number of cases, and which are most likely far, far higher than 212. In terms of substance, the report describes various forms of sexualized torture, including genital electrocution, as we heard, rape, castration and threats of castration, sexual violence against family members, sexualized beating or touching, and forced nudity, among others, which Andrew will expand further in his presentation. As to the why this the sexual violence constitutes Russian state policy, and basically it belongs to the everyday toolkit of occupying authorities, I would like to remind, or we all hear about Russians' relentless daily attacks against Ukrainian cities. However, for Ukrainian population on the ground, on occupied territories, the true horror begins when Russian forces establish control over the territory. Russian occupying forces seek to subjugate Ukrainian population to their political project and to break the back of any resistance. To enact this objective, to enact this goal, they create the so-called filtration campaign, which is basically means massive detention of civilians and ill treatment and torture of the civilians in the detention facilities. Civilians are usually detained on the grounds of actual or perceived pro-Ukrainian views, or due to their active societal status in the society. To facilitate this illegal campaign of detention and torture, Russian forces establish a large-scale network of detention facilities on occupied Ukrainian territories. This network is geographically extended. It's essentially in all regions under Russian control, they establish detention facilities. Our report identifies 15 formalized detention sites where conflict-related sexual violence against men took place, and we believe that actual number of detention facilities much higher, but these are well-documented facilities where they were clearly established as torture and CRMSV sites. In Kherson Oblast, we documented 7 facilities, in Kharkiv 5, and in Zaporozhye 3. Moreover, these are not the only places where acts of CRMSV are committed. Russian military also commits sexual violence outside of formalized detention sites, and this can be anywhere where apprehension of individual takes place. For example, their victims' homes, checkpoints quite often, and other impromptu places of detention. Improvised sites are used more sporadically. However, formalized detention sites operate according to similar perpetrator structures and recurring patterns of violence. And this is one of the key evidence of the whole campaign being an officially approved state policy. In many of these detention facilities across different regions, we see very similar patterns of violence. For example, Russian forces often use code names for certain methods of torture, and these code names are the same across different facilities and regions. So this indicates a coordinated and institutionalized practice. Moreover, sexual violence in formalized and impromptu detention sites often also takes similar forms, which further demonstrates the nature of CRMSV as coordinated policy. Furthermore, detention facilities, the whole network appears to have been also integrated into Russian penitentiary and law enforcement system. For example, the detained Ukrainians from occupied territories are often transferred to detention places or prisons in Russia. Another evidence is also that quite often Russia sends its Ministry of Internal Affairs personnel to Ukraine to operate the detention facilities in Ukraine. So this is a clear evidence of involvement of Russian state apparatus in the execution of detention and torture campaign. Since we're talking about perpetrators, so as I mentioned, Russia often sends Ministry of Internal Affairs personnel to operate the detention sites in Ukraine. So usually one of the main actors who operate detention sites and are like direct perpetrators of torture and CRSV are Russian police officers, essentially. It's either Russian police officers or Rosguardia officers, which is a Russian National Guard. So these are two of the actors, perpetrators, which commit crimes directly. However, the main responsibility for planning, executing, and overseeing the torture and detention campaign rests on FSB, because they are in charge of giving orders to Russian police officers and also to Rosguardia officers. They are also there during interrogations, and sometimes they also participate directly in the tortures. I would like to also briefly mention about inhuman conditions, which Roman already described to some extent. CRMSV under occupation does not occur in a vacuum. It is part of a broader scheme of repression and inhuman conditions. So civilian detainees are not only tortured and ill-treated, however, they are also held in deplorable conditions, such as there is lack of nutrition, lack of sanitation, and very often inadequate medical help. Of course, after being subjected to torture and ill-treatment, and then being kept in such conditions, the recovery is even more complicated and trauma is further deepened. The key goals of the sexual violence is to control, dominate, and humiliate the victim. This tactic is particularly impactful against men, considering the stigma associated with the stigma men experience when they discuss, report, or seek treatment for the sexual violence. The purpose of sexual violence committed by Russian forces is to degrade male victims and to injure their sense of masculinity. As this report demonstrates, Russian forces use this tactic on an unprecedented level against Ukrainian men. Through this report, True Sounds and IPHR wish to amplify the voices of Ukrainian men who survived sexual violence at the hands of the Russian occupying authorities, and to underscore the extent of conflict-related sexual violence against men committed in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam, for introduction. And first of all, thank you, Roman, for stepping up today and talking today. And as long as I work on this topic, every time it feels grave to listen to the stories of the people in person. So today I would like to focus on the three aspects of our report, which are more related to the substance. The first one is the principal forms of the conflict-related sexual violence against men in Ukraine. The second one is the influence of the Russian prison and military hazing culture on the mentioned violence. And the third one is how this supports the qualification as the crimes against humanity under international law. So the central argument of report is basically that sexual violence was one of the mechanisms through which Russian occupation authorities sought to dominate, humiliate, and break the individuals and communities. So let me begin with the forms of violence documented in the survivors' testimonies. So we were using the victim-centered approach and also intersectional approach, and understood the sexual violence basically as a conduct violating the personal sexual autonomy or sexual integrity, and regardless whether the perpetrator got any gratification or whether there were any physical contact with the perpetrator and victim. Determining whether the act was sexual, we considered different factors, including gender, age, culture, religion, and other social factors. So the list you see on this slide, this is not exhaustive. So this is our qualification on different types of the forms of the sexual conduct we noticed from the testimonies. And most of the documented acts independently meet the threshold of torture. So the most widespread form documented was the genital electrocution, which was also mentioned by Roman. We identified at least 80 victims subjected to this practice. Perpetrators commonly used the Soviet TA-57 field telephone, also known as Tapik, and where the electrodes were attached to the penis, testicles, nipples, anus, and other intimate bodies of the person, usually during the first or the second interrogation. What is particularly significant is the existence of the institutionalized terminology, which Maria mentioned before. For example, survivors from the multiple regions independently describe the procedures referred as the call to Zelensky, call to Biden, call to Lenin, call to Putin, and others. All of those names are the combinations of different types, how the stream was connected to different parts of the bodies. For example, not going into much details, but basically different intimate part of the bodies. The same instrument, the same terminology, and the same methods appeared across detention facilities 100 kilometers from each other. The degree of consistency strongly suggests that the practice was transmitted institutionally rather than invented by the individual perpetrators in certain detention facilities. At the Kherson Temporary Detention Center alone, we documented 44 victims of the genital electrocution, and one of the survivors even stated that almost all men were subjected to electric shocks to their genitals during the first or the second interrogation. During the detention, one of the survivors was brought for interrogation several times. Each time, Russian forces tried to break his morale with harsh questions. The interrogation would often have a sexualized overtone. I ask you to excuse my language, but I don't want to soften the real circumstances and actions of Russians. Well, what are you? A faggot, licking the arse of your Führer Zelensky. The interrogations put him backwards in the chair, forced him to strip naked. During the interrogation, he was threatened with rape with a shovel. He was repeatedly subjected to the genital electrocution, including call to Zelensky and call to Biden. Electrodes were attached to his penis, testicles, and nipples. He lost consciousness during the electrocution several times. So the consequences extended far beyond the immediate physical suffering at the place. Survivors reported burns, loss of consciousness, reproductive harm, and severe psychological trauma, including the suicidal ideas after the interrogations. In one of the documented cases, perpetrators connected electrodes to the victim's genitals and stated, "Now we're going to sterilize you." The damage inflicted was not only physical, but also psychological. In our conversation with the survivors, we seen a lot of reports from the people which were subjected to the genital electrocution were coming back to the normal life and doing, for example, the spermogram, which was absolutely clean. It means that basically during the genital electrocution, they cannot have kids anymore. And a lot of the people who were detained were also the young age, which also even more morally damaging for them. Well, I will not go through all of the forms, but I will just name some of the main ones. We also documented 31 cases of rape and 44 threats of rape, and it's not even counting, for example, when it's like electrocution of the genitals, where the wire could be inserted into the anus, which also basically penetration, which could be counted as a rape. Again, the same pattern emerged repeatedly: rape as object, homophobic insults, threat to transform victim into the roosters or faggots, and deliberate use to sexual violence as the mechanism of humiliation and domination. We also documented 11 cases in which detainees were forced to commit sexual acts against one another. At least one detention facility maintained a separate area for detainees who had been sexually abused or labeled as the sexually degraded. At the extreme end of the spectrum, so one of the detention centers basically had what they called the faggot cell, where they were throwing people and basically forced other detainees to rape those detainees. we also noted the 3 cases of castration. Those are people from the hearsay because they didn't survive, so we couldn't interview them. And also 23 documented cases of the threats of castration, which was extremely widespread as the matter of the humiliation, and basically that the perpetrators were saying that they will make you a woman out of you as the matter of humiliation. So this acts perhaps like the clearest expression of what many perpetrators sought to achieve, and basically the violent destruction of the masculine identity, bodily autonomy, and as well as the reproductive capacity. Yeah, and the forms I just described did not emerge spontaneously in occupied Ukraine. So in our understandings, many of them also reflect the long-standing tradition in Russia, prisoner and military institutions. For example, Russian prisoner culture is structured around the rigid hierarchy. At its bottom stands the category of petuhi, which basically means roosters, and in other understanding is basically the graded caste. So within the system, the sexual violence functions as not as expression of desire, but as a mechanism of domination, humiliation, and social exclusion. So it means that the perpetrator also get the endorsement from the public of the prison, and the person who got to be the victim basically got all the humiliation. So, and we see that significantly for the same language appeared to be in occupied Ukraine. Survivors describe the references to rooster, faggot cells, and threat to turn detainees into roosters, basically. They are not generic insult, they're just basically targeted coming from the Russian prison. And what Mariam also mentioned, we see that some of the detention facilities in occupied parts of Ukraine have a guards from the Russian internal ministry service, which basically was guarding prisons there. And if we go deeper on this, we see that the prisoner guards in Russian prisons are really deeply interconnected with the Russian prisonal culture overall. So they're not something separate from this. And also, we also see the same patterns of Dedovshchina. Basically, it's a means of the grandfather rule in the Russian army, where the military hazing is basically always in the circle. When the newcomers are coming, they go under the humiliation and as well as a sexual hazing, and then later they become those who do the sexual hazing. So basically, when such soldiers come to the occupied parts, they let themselves to go loose on something which, for example, was normal for them when they're coming to the army, but now with the civilian population. So switching to probably more boring part, I'm sorry, the legal qualification. So the report, first of all, we show the qualification of crimes against humanity because we see how widespread and how systematic it is, and we believe that this qualification reflects much better what's going on in Ukraine rather than just war crimes, which is rather isolated cases. So, and our main conclusions were to qualify it basically as a torture under Article 171F of the Rome Statute, and as well as the other acts of the sexual violence under Article 71G. I mean, obviously, we can also talk about the rape or enforced sterilization, which is more straightforward for qualification. However, there are a lot of different acts like genital electrocution, sexualized beatings, forced nudity, and threats directed at the victim's sexual integrity, which could not really fall under those categories. So almost all of the acts are most likely to constitute a torture. And indeed, the qualification them as a torture has the important advantages. This is the widely used qualification across different tribunals and courts. So, and as well as from the point of view of academical discussion, torture basically qualifies not artificially dividing the qualification, some certain episode of sexual violence, but take it more as the overall. But at the same time, exclusive focus on torture risks to obscuring the specificality of the sexual dimension of the harm. And especially it's extremely relevant in a sexual dimension of the harm to the male victims, which, as some may know, that international tribunals were pretty much struggling to qualify it properly and call it a sexual violence. We've seen a lot of different qualifications, as in the infamous case of Kenyatta, the penile amputation was qualified as other inhuman acts. And this is not the incidental case. This was pretty widespread practice on this. So we believe that there is the great value added to qualify it straightly as the other forms of the sexual violence in the present case. So in the end, I would like to thank, first of all, to all survivors who made this report possible because of their courage to step forward and tell their stories. this report was overall possible and collection all of this information was possible. And as well as we only 2 people who are sitting here from the legal team, but there is the huge work of a lot of people in the organization, like a field team who go in closer to the front lines and risking their lives to collect those testimonies, interview the people, and contribute to this. And as well as other colleagues, we have colleague Evan, who also was one of the authors of the report. He's now in the public. But so thank you very much for everybody who working on this, and we hope that this will give the result we all desire so much.
Thank you. Thank you both, and thank you for sticking to the time. It's an enormous amount of work, and I really want to also congratulate you with this achievement and with putting in so much effort to make it understandable. And of course, this is just a snippet. The report will be available, as I mentioned, so in about 20 minutes, you can download it. And yes, exactly. Do not do it now, please. And I think what we heard now is, of course, the basis, the facts, the evidence, some legal qualification. And our panel will now help us understand what that evidence means for accountability processes, for accountability for survivors, and for the systems that are meant to serve them. I would like to welcome our panelists, Anna Sosonska, representative of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, the Partner for Combating Crimes Committed in the Context of Armed Conflict, dealing with CRSV crimes, and Dr. Evelina Ochap, a senior program lawyer at the IBA's Human Rights Institute, whose work on accountability many of us will be familiar with. So I would like to start with a question for you both. The report focuses specifically on sexual violence against men, and yet we know that conflict-related sexual violence as a category has long struggled for attention, and let alone its male dimension, as was mentioned by multiple speakers today. So my first question is, what are the main challenges in investigating and prosecuting these crimes nationally or internationally? And what, if anything, distinguishes CRSV against men from other forms of CRSV? Is there anything specific that needs to be paid attention to? Maybe, Anna, if you could go first.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so happy to be here again. The Hague is the place of justice, I believe, and I'm very happy to see many familiar faces here. Some of you I met in Ukraine, some of you I met in the frontline region in Ukraine and here in The Hague. So I'd like to start my discussion with that point that unfortunately for a conflict-related sexual violence, there is not easy thing to provide testimonies for to the law enforcement system, unfortunately. I think not only in Ukraine we struggle with this situation, but like all over the world. And the biggest obstacle for investigators and prosecutors is the very fact of its mass commission of such crimes in a temporary occupied part of Ukraine, in this special premises, facilities, and also in the territory of Russian Federation. And those of you who have already seen the recent report of UN Secretary General regarding conflict-related sexual violence, by the way, there is a historical precedent because the Russian Federation was included in the list of shame for CRSV crimes, and that is the first time when Russian Federation was brought to some form of international accountability for the mass commission of its crimes. And actually, Ambassador Kostin has mentioned in his speech that Office of the Prosecutor General starts to work with male survivors since the moment of establishing the specialized division. And we faced with actually huge reluctance from their side to testify to the law enforcement system, because by that time the lack of our expertise, the lack of probably you know, law enforcement system, it's not the pleasant thing and not the, you know, the comfortable place where you can dare to testify. And actually now with establishing a good cooperation with non-government organization which represent the interest of male survivors, things became much better. And but still we have some like facts that remain. The obstacles in our criminal proceeding, there is like the person might not feel safe and might feel not protected, and the constant fear that Russian Federation may come back to the territories which were under its occupation. And the next fact is the stigmatization and condemnation by the society, and the small societies they carry on living in. Unfortunately, it still remains, and I have to indicate that. And the other thing is the person fears of testifying officially. You have heard the story of survivors, Roman, that male survivors can discuss their things between each other because they're equal in their pain. It's horrible, but they're equal. But it's another thing to dare to testify to, like, for example, woman prosecutor, if you are a man. Because of this culture of masculinity, we have to acknowledge the Ukrainian society also is a quite patriarchal, strong patriarchal society, because we are post-Soviet, unfortunately, part of society. And that is the root for this social stigma and for this stigmatization. And unfortunately, a relatively small number of appeals to law enforcement system agency is due to a number of that reasons. And I just want to wrap up that part of my speech by saying that victims worry about the safety of not only of their lives, but their family members. And that is something that we should take into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and massive kudos for hosting us here today, and indeed to Roman and other survivors who testified to ensure that this report came into being. Incredible work, very important work as well, and especially as we continue to learn more about the experiences of men with conflict-related sexual violence. And let me start by saying a little bit more about conflict-related sexual violence and why Russia is also resorting to the use of conflict-related sexual violence, because I think this is very, very important to emphasize. And indeed, if you look at wars from recent years and atrocity crimes, conflict-related sexual violence has been used across all of them. There is no exception. It has been used again and again and again, and there is a reason for this. And it is because conflict-related sexual violence is effective. And in the words of Dr. Mukwege, an incredible gynecologist and who has been working with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in the DRC, he always says, and paraphrasing him, that this kind of violence does not only break the victim, it breaks family unit, it breaks whole communities. And because of that, it will continue being used across all conflicts. And indeed, that's the case also with Russia's war on Ukraine. And I remember in the very first weeks of the war, we had few Ukrainian parliamentarians coming to the UK Parliament and telling us already about the evidence of the use of conflict-related sexual violence. At the time, they told us about the use of such violence against women and girls, but we knew that also men, especially in detention, will be subjected to such violence as well. And this is because of the stigma that Ambassador Kostin mentioned. And of course, we already heard why Russia is using this kind of violence against men, and you will see it also in the report about the humiliation, degradation, and emasculating victims, which again, it's to not only cause the pain and suffering, but also psychological trauma for years and decades to come. So this is, of course, about conflict-related sexual violence more broadly, but of course, in case of such violence being used against men, and especially men in detention, there are various aspects that ultimately will mean that we'll not hear much about it. It will take a long time before we'll actually have a clear picture of the scale of the crimes, and even more so before we see anything being done, unfortunately. And of course, Anna also mentioned already, and previous speakers also mentioned, access to victim survivors. As long as they are in detention, will not know the full scale of the abuse they suffer. And it is, I think, safe to conclude that as long as they're detained, they will be subjected to such atrocities on a regular basis. Documentation will be also a problem. Again, Ukraine is doing an incredible thing in terms of justice and accountability, and has been doing that from day one, focusing on documentation, focusing on making sure that Ukraine is prosecuting the perpetrators. But if you look at the website of the Office of the Prosecutor General, there have been some 250,000 criminal cases registered through that website. There may be some of them may refer to the same incident, but nonetheless, we are talking about thousands and thousands of cases. And the Ukrainian justice system will struggle with them. That's very clear. Any country in the world would struggle with this number of cases, let alone during an ongoing war. And indeed, with Ukraine Bar Association, we've been monitoring some of the ongoing trials. And again, Ukraine is doing incredible work in prosecuting the perpetrators as the war is ongoing. But they face also lots of challenges, including ongoing bombardments, which do not stop only because Ukraine wants to see justice. And again, a massive, it's impressive work that Ukraine is doing, putting so much effort into justice and accountability as the war is ongoing. It's unprecedented. We've never seen anything of this sort before. But documentation, as it will continue, of course, especially of conflict-related sexual violence, is something that needs to be done right. And indeed, there are several international protocols, like the International Protocol for Documenting Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, the Murat Code, which tell us how to do it right and when such documentation should be done. It's not about just investigators and documenters going into the field and starting doing this work. Victim survivors need to be ready to be able to testify. Their safety, their safety and their interest need to be prioritized, and they need to be provided with the assistance that often, especially during conflict situations, is lacking. And again, in the case of Ukraine, we are talking about so many different atrocity crimes being perpetrated on a regular basis. So in terms of needs of victim survivors of all those crimes, Ukraine will struggle with it. And this is where the support from the international community is so key. We've heard a little bit about the stigma, so I will not comment on this more, but I wanted to very briefly talk about impunity and the effect of impunity on victims and survivors. We heard today from Roman, we've heard from other victim survivors over the months and years. But something what, unfortunately, they will know also about is the fact that impunity for this kind of atrocity crimes is a norm. We don't see justice and accountability for this type of crimes. So this impunity will also mean that victim survivors will remain very often silent. Because why would they put themselves through this system if impunity will be the end result of it? And we've seen it across many other situations of atrocity crimes when victim survivors testified, but unfortunately, they did not see justice and accountability being done at the end of the day. And this impunity for atrocity crimes of this sort, and especially having this significant effect on victim survivors and whole communities and for generations to come, will ultimately, of course, have a significant effect and prevent them from speaking out. And I know that we'll be discussing in a moment a little bit more about justice and accountability efforts, and I'll be happy to comment on this as well.
Thank you, Evelina. So Anna, you already mentioned the issue of specialization, of having skills that are required to work with this category of survivors and to investigate these specific crimes. So turning to the specific question of accountability in Ukraine, how does the Prosecutor General's office approach investigations and prosecutions, to the extent that's possible to discuss here, of these crimes? And is conflict-related sexual violence against men treated as a distinct category in your work? Is it part of the general work of your department? And is there a strategy in place for ensuring that these crimes are investigated and prosecuted?
Thank you for this question. And I would like to start with a very practical thing, that there is a specialization in a central level in the Office of the Prosecutor General. Also, we have some specialized unit in frontline regions, RPOs, Regional Prosecutor's Office. So totally we have one specialized unit in the structure of the Prosecutor General Office and 11 in the frontline regions. And also, but we also managed to establish this precise specialization all over Ukraine, even at those territories where we haven't had a specialized war crime units. Also, we encourage our colleagues from the State Security Service of Ukraine and National Police of Ukraine to establish the same proper specialization of investigating in their structure. Because the way how the Ukrainian law enforcement system is organized and structured, it like basically we have two agencies who which conduct pre-trial investigation. There is a State Security Service of Ukraine and National Police of Ukraine. They have a specialized agreement that the State Security Service of Ukraine investigate cases where they have conflict-related sexual violence against prisoners of war, and National Police of Ukraine investigate such cases where the victims are from a civilian population. And prosecutorial agencies supervise on the pretrial investigation and maintain state prosecution in court. And actually, there is a part of our comprehensive approach. So we investigate and prosecute conflict-related sexual violence not as a separate facts of its committings, but at the broader picture of atrocities, as a broader picture and a part of a Russian plan of committing such fact as a plan of capturing and seizing Ukrainian territories. And actually, Evelina has mentioned why Russian Federation uses conflict-related sexual violence, because unfortunately, I have to say that that is the cheapest method of waging a war, and the cheapest method to establish the control over a civilian population in occupied territories. And it requires the more comprehensive approach in our criminal proceedings. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to share the accurate data on conflict-related sexual violence committed against prisoners of war. But in this regard, I would reflect to the database of a UN Special Monitoring Commission in Ukraine, because their findings are quite accurate. I try to stay very diplomatic, even though I'm not. Their findings are very accurate, and their findings in the report truly reflects our own criminal proceeding, if I'll put it in that way. Yeah, and actually, in the structure of my division, we have at least 3 specialized units, and prosecutors from that specialized unit have been dealing with different categories of conflict-related sexual violence in its mass. So, for example, the first specialized unit, they've been dealing with international crimes committed against prisoners of war, including conflict-related sexual violence. The second unit, the prosecutors have been dealing with conflict-related sexual wars against civilian detainees and the special mechanism that Russian Federation established for deported civilians from the newly occupied territories. And the third unit, there is like the specialized conflict-related sexual violence prosecuting unit. And by the way, I have to mention that the fourth unit is the International Crimes Committed Against Cultural Heritage of Ukraine. Don't ask me the reason why we established such a weird specialization within the same department, because I truly don't know. And actually, I have to say also that we registered one priority case on crimes against humanity, and conflict-related sexual violence is being prosecuted as the part of these criminal proceedings. But also we have many separate cases on conflict-related sexual violence applied against male victims as a separate cases. So the number of these criminal proceedings has been voiced today by the Ambassador Kostin. And actually, yes, so there is like two ways of our specialization and two ways of our comprehensive approaches. And the last point I would like to say that we have it's the prioritization of prosecuting conflict-related sexual violence as one of the main priority for the Office Prosecutor General. It is formally it was reflected in the strategy a strategic plan for the exercise of prosecutorial powers in the field of criminal prosecuting of conflict-related sexual violence, which was approved by the Prosecutor General in 2023, and now it is reflects in our new strategy for the exercise of powers of the prosecuting authorities in criminal prosecution of international crimes for 2026-2028. It was recently approved on April 23 this year, and it's publicly available at the official website of the Office of the Prosecutor General. I've just checked if it's available in English. Unfortunately not, but I definitely know it's been translated, so I'll ask my protocol department to upload the English version of the strategic plan as soon as it's been interpreted. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's very impressive, the specialization and all the units that you have. It's also so unfortunate that Ukraine is now the most specialized when it comes to dealing with these crimes. And of course, we would like other nation states to also support, not only in providing trainings or funding, but also taking on some cases on the basis of universal jurisdiction, on the basis of other basis of extraterritorial jurisdiction as well. And they may not have the same capacity, so you probably will have some knowledge sharing to do in the future. And Evelina, I would now like to bring this international dimension. Ukraine should not be left to pursue accountability alone. And only in this report already the scale is huge and it demands a coordinated response. And we know that this is just a part of it. So what can national authorities in other countries do concretely to support Ukraine's law enforcement efforts?
Thank you very much. And indeed, Ukraine is doing or has taken very important steps to ensure that the atrocities are documented and also prosecuted. And indeed, several trials are ongoing. And recently, only I believe a couple of weeks ago, I was also in Ukraine, and we're launching with Ukraine Bar Association a new report that looked into the trials that have been conducted so far, and emphasizing, of course, that Ukraine is doing everything what it can to ensure that they're in accordance with the international standards of the right to a fair trial. But as I mentioned, there are so many cases and so many crimes have been committed so far, and they will continue being committed as long as this war is ongoing. And the 250,000 reported cases through the website of the Ukraine, of the Prosecutor General is just a tip of the iceberg, and we'll hear more and more about such crimes. So it is, of course, important that we look to support and look into best ways to support Ukraine in this endeavor. And of course, the International Criminal Court is also looking into the atrocities, but ultimately the International Criminal Court will look into few cases, few of the perpetrators, the leaders, but not into the thousands and thousands of perpetrators who have been committing those crimes. And as it happens, of course, a number of countries started looking into the crimes committed in Ukraine. At least 18 countries opened structural investigations into the crimes, which ultimately means that they started collecting some of the evidence, starting to look into the patterns, identifying the crimes that have been perpetrated, identifying some of the perpetrators. Then, of course, look into whether they could potentially prosecute the crimes, and we've seen some of very proactive approaches. For example, in Germany, Germany opened structured investigation into the crimes committed by Russia against Ukraine very early on, and started collecting the data. And we've seen such investigations and such documentation processes across many different European countries and outside of European countries, of course, as well. And even in the UK, which has a very narrow approach to universal jurisdiction, to say the least, we've seen that as Ukrainians were Ukrainian refugees were arriving in the UK started documenting some of the crimes. But I think one of the problems, especially in the UK, is very much the very narrow approach to universal jurisdiction. And I will mention it in a moment. But there are several countries which have so-called pure universal jurisdiction, pure model of universal jurisdiction, and Germany and Argentina are two of the examples. The Netherlands has a very good approach to universal jurisdiction as well, and which enabled prosecution of Daesh perpetrators of torture in Syria and many other countries. We've seen good examples from France, from Sweden, from several countries which wanted to ensure that they play a role in ensuring justice and accountability for international crimes. But of course, this is not always possible. And just if I briefly complain about the UK, if I may. I live in the UK. I work on legal reforms in the UK, and for now it has not been successful, and I need to vent it a little bit. So in the UK, UK has universal jurisdiction when it comes to torture, of course, and also in relation to breaches of the Geneva Conventions. Great, but what about the Rome Statute crimes? According to the International Criminal Court Act from 2001, British authorities can investigate and prosecute international Rome Statute crimes if they are committed by British citizens or residents. So this is a significant limitation. Even if some of the alleged perpetrators come to the UK, there's nothing we can do. And if we think about some of the Russian alleged perpetrators of the crimes, will they have some properties in the UK? Will they send their family members to British schools? Come to use the wonderful hospitals? Very likely, but there is nothing we can do. And indeed, earlier this year, British politicians had a very important legal reform, which I have been supporting, which was to remove the requirement of British citizenship or residency in order to initiate such investigations and prosecutions. And it was not supported by the government, unfortunately. But maybe with the new Prime Minister, that is yet to be announced, maybe this will change. Let's see. But ultimately, of course, this limitation means that UK will be a safe haven for alleged perpetrators of international crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence committed against Ukrainians. And Ambassador Kostin mentioned that, of course, we need to make sure that there were no safe havens. But unfortunately, UK, with the current legislation, is a safe haven. And this needs to change in order to support victim survivors who come forward and testify and share the pain and suffering. And the burden cannot be only on them to share their stories and for the international community to remain silent in such cases. So there is a lot that needs to happen in terms of countries around the world, making sure that their legislation, domestic legislation, enables investigations and prosecutions of international crimes, and especially that we see this willingness of victim survivors to come forward to testify, we need to do our share as well and ensure that our systems, our judicial systems, are ready to deal with the evidence and be able to prosecute the perpetrators. And in terms of also of conflict-related sexual violence, we've seen already good examples. There have been investigations open, including in Germany and Austria, specifically looking into conflict-related sexual violence. So there are opportunities in those countries, and we as the international community, again, need to support victim survivors to be able to testify and help them through this process. And I know that a number of countries are also supporting a new initiative, which will be in Ukraine, to document and to train documenters in documenting evidence of conflict-related sexual violence. I already mentioned to you the international protocol and the Murad Code, very important guidance that are to ensure that the documenters can do their work and can engage with victim survivors safely. And we need to see more of this kind of initiatives. Again, it is not only about sending documenters to the field, but to make sure that they're able to do it safely for victim survivors and prioritizing and putting victim survivors first rather than anything else. And I'll be happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you. So just one more question from me. So for the audience, this is your moment to start thinking of your questions. We will open the floor in a couple of minutes. I wanted to close this panel discussion with a question that I think it's to something the report also points to. And here I would also welcome reflections not only from Anna and Evelina, but from our colleagues from Truth Hounds and IPHR. So criminal justice is an essential tool. I myself, I'm a criminal lawyer. I prefer criminal law solutions, but it is not sufficient. And we all know that it is not sufficient. Anybody that has worked in conflict-related settings and in not conflict-related settings understands that there is a role for criminal justice, and then there's everything else that surrounds it. So for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, this path runs through many institutions, right? Medical, social, psychological, legal. And what are the needs that you think fall outside the criminal justice response currently in Ukraine? Where are the gaps? And how could other societal bodies or human rights bodies or civil society could contribute with support? I don't know who would like to take the floor first. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, the easy answer is to ask the survivors. So I feel like that's the main rule we should all follow when we're talking about any type of justice. I mean, obviously, as for lawyers, it's easy to get stuck into the idea that we will go to the court and everything will be resolved. And not really fun fact, it's not. Because first of all, the justice is pretty individual thing for everybody, and it's not only means going to the court and bringing somebody for sentence and the prison. I mean, obviously, it is in a certain matter, but for a lot of people, if you start talking and asking them what does it mean for them, but for a lot of them, it just means, for example, to be able to live their normal life again, for example, to reinstate in society, to be able to go to job fully, not having some panic attacks at some point, and that's something which, for example, could be enough for them as well. Because I mean, if you're talking about the regular criminal justice, first of all, we need to realize that majority, like, we've been a couple of years ago into the countries of the former Yugoslavian war. We talked with a lot of documenters and organizations which were there. And to be fair, the justice there is really hard thing to talk about, because we know about thousands of the survivors who never basically got their justice in the court. And the second of all, it's also super long, and it takes a lot of time, and even if it's feasible, possible. So we basically need to see and to react right now to somehow support those people who need it the most. And so I talked with, actually what's interesting, I talked with Roman about this yesterday, and he gave really nice opinion about this. So basically his organization, they're trying not to give the survivors, for example, who are coming back from the Russian territory to Ukraine, not, he's saying in his word, not to give the fish, but to give the fish and stick. So basically they are trying to employ those people, to trying to reinstate them in their lifespan, just to be the integral part of society again, and have a feeling that basically you can function as you used to before. And so I think all of us pretty often just need to go a bit more to the ground and ask survivors what the first of all matters for them, and support, for example, their ground initiatives, which are basically working for reinstating them into society. Because nobody probably except them knows better what could be the best option for them, basically, for this. And this includes the lot of type of action from the mental, from the support of the mental capacity, mental health, psychiatrist helps, as well as, for example, support advocacy on the legislation change, for example, inside of Ukraine. And so it's multidimensional thing, and we just need to continue this dialogue and identify what is the main priorities and the main vectors of the development on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything to add?
Yes, I just want to add one point. You know, that's like this needs is it's being perfectly formulated by survivors, and it sounds like nothing about us without us, and it's also the title of the recent report of the good friend of mine, Dr. Ingrid Elliott. And there is actually, I would like to quote this, and I'll proceed with the quotation. Armed with innovations and guidance, efforts should concentrate on the mindful creation of more spaces of co-creation and mainstreaming survivors' expertise end-to-end in policy development and programming, regardless of sector. More accessible, inclusive capacity building initiatives for a diverse range of survivors are needed. Practitioners should reflect on their role and control and should re-examine professional objectives, standards, and training to embody how better to work together with and in support of survivors. And I think that could be the best thing to voice for this.
Thank you. I would like to now open the floor. Just a couple of notes. Please raise your hand if you have a question. A colleague with a microphone will come to you. Please stand up, state your name and affiliation. Short question, comments rather than questions may be better for reception. And please state to whom your question is addressed. So there's one question in the back and one question in the front for now.
Good evening. My name is Lagbalao George. First of all, as a Ukrainian, I want to thank to Roman. Можете зняти наушники. Щиро дякую вам за захист нашої держави. Від усієї молоді ми повернемося, відбудуємо країну. Continuing with the question, so my brother works in the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine, and recently he had a conversation with the psychologist that deals with one of the victims. And recalling this conversation, I have a question for you. So when documenting a sexual violence against men, how do investigators or institutions, they balance the effectiveness of the investigation with all these details, with all these nuances repeating from the victim again and again, with the risk of making trauma of the victim even more? And on average, how many times the survivor should recall his experiences to different authorities like human organizations or investigators or prosecutors and so on and so forth. And the reason why I ask this, because in Ukraine, as you mentioned before, we don't have very strong system of helping those men. And from my mother, who works as a doctor, I know that many people have a big depression after this, after revealings, and there is a big quantity of men that end up their lives because of these revealings. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, the question in the front as well. We'll take a few at a time. Simon, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Simon Baposhvili. I work for IPHR. I have a couple of questions. One is to Roman, which is kind of rebouncing the question that has been asked already. Roman, thanks first of all for traveling all the way here to speak with the audience. We appreciate it very much. I just wonder what justice looks like for you personally. What would be the outcome that you would like to see when this is all over? What is it exactly? And other question is, I don't know, everyone in the panel, you know, one day there will be end to this war, there will be some sort of ceasefire, peace agreement, etc. And usually when this happens, you know, negotiations include some concessions about justice and accountability, immunities, etc. What are the red lines for you personally that should not be crossed when peace agreement is signed and when these accountability clauses are negotiated? Thank you.
Perhaps we can start with the first question then on re-traumatization and multiple interviewing. I see Evelina is ready to start.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very important question. And indeed, that's the reason I mentioned the international protocol and the Murad Code, because they are both are exactly about that. Something what it's very clear from both documents is that you shouldn't just go and start documenting the atrocities. You need to identify who is doing this work, because there may be already some documentation processes being undertaken. And of course, this kind of risk assessment and identifying who is doing what is very much to ensure that we don't ask one survivor several times to tell the same story, because this increases the risk of traumatization. And indeed, the whole international protocol especially is all about neutralizing that risk and making sure that a survivor doesn't have to tell the story again and again and again. And there is no you ask on average how many times victim survivors should be asked. Ideally, just once, and that's it, and it's documented the right way, and it can be used for future prosecutions. Victim survivors shouldn't be asked again and again, but the reality is that unfortunately, victim survivors are asked to tell their stories again and again. Very often, they are not documented the right way. Very often documenters don't have the knowledge and skills to be able to document such atrocities the right way. And this ultimately will affect not only the chances of seeing justice and accountability in the future, but re-traumatizing the victim survivor. Very often as well, victim survivors are asked to testify without even checking what are their needs and making sure that they are provided with the assistance that they need to be able to testify safely. And I mentioned to you two documents, the International Protocol and the Murad Code, but then you have also a very important document from the Office of the Prosecutor from the ICC on documentation done by civil society organizations. And this important document also talks about not documenting, but making sure that victim survivors are connected with the Office of the Prosecutor, and the Office of the Prosecutor can do this work themselves and can provide victim survivors with the assistance that they will need. So I think knowing the best practices for documentation is key. Knowing who is doing what is key, and making sure that we ask those questions before we start asking victim survivors about their experiences. And again, putting victim survivors first. So it's not about the documentation process itself, but asking the survivor, what do they need, whether they are provided with the assistance, and then working from there. But this is priority. And even if later on they decide not to testify, that's fine, because it's all about the victim survivor and their best interest, their well-being.
Yes, Mariam, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for your questions. I will speak on behalf of our field team, which I have not participated in the missions personally, but yeah, I'm aware of how they work, and I can talk about a couple of things couple of measures that we take to mitigate the risks that Evelina was just describing. And we are aware that we can never completely eliminate risks of re-traumatization. However, there are some measures that we can take, and we do take. For example, specialized trainings for our field documenters, which all of them are trained, and so they are aware of the protocols that Evelina mentioned and how to comply with them. Another measure is definitely coordination with other actors, including governmental actors and also other CSOs. And this is also why we had joined missions together with Truthhound. So we coordinate this between each other, and we do not interview same victim several times. And one last measure that we take is to have a combination of specialists in a team when the interview process takes place. For example, we have a psychologist during the interview present, as well as lawyers, so they can advise the survivor about their legal situation and etc. So there are definitely some measures to take to mitigate these risks. Thank you.
Anna, would you like as well?
Just one point that I would like to add, that in our legal system, in Ukrainian legal system, it's almost impossible not to approach the same person twice or even more time. And the reason why, there is just the very simple fact that one person can obtain two different procedural status within the same criminal proceedings. For example, he or she can be a victim of the crime, but also a witness. And it requires, according to Ukrainian legislation, it requires that the law enforcement system should interview him or her twice in its separate roles as a victim and as a witnesses. So unfortunately, we can't fully avoid the risk of re-traumatization, but of course we can simplify and make it more comfortable to interact with law enforcement system by introducing new victim-oriented approaches. For example, we introduced and now we use a peace interview model for interviewing prisoners of war and civilian detainees who have been returned from the captivity of the Russian Federation. So yeah, we can fully avoid it, but we can definitely make it more comfortable.
Thank you. And I think I will go to the third question first, because I will give Roman the floor as a closing speaker last. So first, let's go to the question on the red lines in any peace negotiations. And that, I think, is also a personal, not only professional question. So whoever would like to go first, please. So hardest questions for last. Do we leave this for the reception?
Well, I believe Simon put us in the position which is pretty complicated yeah.
We can cut this part. Speak freely.
Well, yeah, obviously. I mean, it's an extremely hard topic to talk about. I mean, if you're talking in the dimension of today's presentation about the sexual violence, I mean, obviously, my position is that there shouldn't be any amnesties for the people who perpetrated the war crimes and especially the sexual violence. So this is something which should be the red line during the negotiation, just as this, like, otherwise, like, the question appears: what is this all for? What are all those documentation? What are all those efforts to document the truth, so the truth will not be distorted in the future? So we just agree that we can just close the eyes on this truth and not really do anything about it. So I feel like recognizing the possibility of amnesty is somehow just defeating the purpose of everything we are doing and the bravery of those survivors who already stepped public and shared their stories and did a lot of efforts in this field. So yeah, I believe there should be a red line.
Thank you. Everyone's in agreement. So as the last speaker, I will let Roman talk about what would justice look like to you. Please.
Personally, I gave testimony on CRSV on 2 occasions. Once to an investigator, and again during an interview for the International Urgent Interim Reparations Mechanism, and there have been many other interviews on this subject as well. On the question of re-traumatization, I would say this depends entirely on each individual's psychological state. Whether re-traumatization occurs or not is personal to each person. On the question of justice, for me, justice means, first, seeing all of them in the dock once we have achieved our victory, of course. Second, it means dignified reparations, so that those who suffered can restore their psychological state and their health. I would also like to thank the organizers. For our organization, it is extremely important that the experience of people who have survived unlawful deprivation of liberty, CRSV, torture, and other grave consequences of the war is heard at the international level. It is only through dialogue, recognition, and joint work by the state, international partners, and survivors themselves that an effective system of support and justice can be built. We are grateful to our international partners for their attention to this important issue, and we continue working to ensure that survivors' rights are not only recognized, but properly protected. Thank you.
Дякую. I am glad I don't have to do the wrapping up now because Roman did it for us. And I think it's very difficult to wrap up an evening like this with so much information, but also so much emotion and solidarity and empathy. And I think all I can say is that for me, at least, we always hear so much darkness. We hear so much violence. We know that so many things are going on and we feel quite powerless to do something. And I think with evenings like this, we turn our attention to resistance, to the light, to doing something. And while it might be difficult to listen, I think we're all still quite privileged to be here, to be able to listen, and to think of what our own role is in all of this and what steps we can take. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Roman, our supporters, the Embassy of Lithuania, the Embassy of Ukraine, International Bar Association. I'd like to thank True Hounds, International Partnership for Human Rights, also for being here and for presenting the report. And finally, I would like to thank you, the audience, for being here, for listening, and for being engaged. And I would like to invite you for a reception to continue this conversation further. Thank you. Thank you.
You can find the report available by the QR codes on the slides.